He mocked her simple binoculars, then froze. When the 3,000 new 47-meter spotter record emerged. Sarah Martinez had always been different from her co-workers at the military reconnaissance base. While others invested in the latest high-tech equipment and bragged about their expensive gear, she carried a pair of worn binoculars that looked like they belonged in a museum. The black paint had chipped away in several places, revealing the metal underneath, and the leather strap was cracked from years of use. These weren't just any ordinary binoculars, though. They were her grandfather's World War II Zeiss binoculars, passed down through 3 generations of military service. Every morning, Sarah would arrive at the observation post overlooking the valley, carefully cleaning the lenses with a soft cloth before beginning her shift. Her colleagues would often snicker at the sight of her ancient equipment. Marcus Thompson, a cocky young officer fresh from the academy, was particularly vocal about his disdain for what he called antique junk. He would wave his state-of-the-art digital spotting scope and make comments about how Sarah was living in the Stone Age. The military base was responsible for monitoring a vast stretch of mountainous terrain, watching for any unusual activity or potential threats. It was precision work that required not just good equipment, but exceptional skill and patience. Sarah had been doing this job for 8 years. Ever since she completed her military training, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot movement and identify objects at incredible distances. Her supervisors had noticed her talent early on, but they attributed it to luck rather than skill. Marcus had joined the unit 6 months ago, armed with the most advanced equipment money could buy. His digital scope could magnify objects up to 60 times their normal size and had built-in range-finding capabilities. It connected to a tablet that could record video, take photographs, and even measure wind speed. The device had cost the military nearly $15,000, and Marcus never let anyone forget it. He would constantly compare his modern technology to Sarah's primitive binoculars, suggesting that she was holding back the entire unit's effectiveness. During briefings, Marcus would openly question why the military continued to allow outdated equipment in such a critical role. He argued that Sarah's binoculars were a liability, claiming that modern warfare demanded modern tools. The other soldiers began to take sides, with some supporting Marcus's technological approach while others defended Sarah's proven track record. The tension in the unit was growing daily, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere that affected everyone's performance. Sarah rarely responded to Marcus's provocations. She had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words. Her grandfather had taught her that the best equipment was worthless without skill, patience, and understanding. He had used these same binoculars to spot enemy positions during crucial battles in Europe, helping to save countless lives. The weight of that history gave Sarah strength. During the difficult moments when her colleagues questioned her methods, the breaking point came during a routine training exercise designed to test the unit's spotting abilities. The exercise involved identifying various targets placed throughout the valley at different distances and elevations. Points were awarded based on accuracy, speed of identification, and the ability to provide precise coordinates. Marcus saw this as his opportunity to finally prove that technology trumped experience. As the exercise began, Marcus quickly set up his digital equipment, connecting cables and adjusting settings on his tablet. The scope's built-in computer began calculating distances and environmental factors automatically. Meanwhile, Sarah simply raised her grandfather's binoculars and began her methodical scan of the valley. She moved slowly and deliberately, her trained eye picking up subtle details that others might miss. The first few targets were relatively easy to spot, large objects placed in obvious locations. Both Marcus and Sarah identified these quickly, along with most of the other participants. As the exercise progressed, the targets became smaller and more cleverly concealed. Some were partially hidden behind rocks or vegetation, while others were positioned at extreme distances that tested the limits of human vision. Marcus became increasingly frustrated as his expensive equipment failed to provide the decisive advantage he had expected. The digital scope's automatic features sometimes focused on the wrong objects, and the bright display screen was difficult to read in direct sunlight. He found himself constantly adjusting settings and troubleshooting technical problems, while Sarah continued her steady, systematic observation. What Marcus and the others didn't know was that Sarah had spent countless hours studying the terrain through her binoculars. She knew every rock formation, every tree, and every shadow pattern in the valley. This intimate knowledge allowed her to immediately recognize when something was out of place. Her grandfather had taught her that successful spotting wasn't just about magnification, it was about understanding the environment so thoroughly that any change became immediately apparent. As the exercise continued, Sarah began identifying targets that others had missed entirely. She called out coordinates for a camouflaged vehicle hidden in a grove of trees nearly 2 miles away. She spotted a sniper dummy positioned on a cliff face that blended almost perfectly with the surrounding rock. Each successful identification was verified by the exercise coordinators, who were beginning to take notice of her exceptional performance. Marcus was becoming increasingly agitated. Despite his technological advantages, he was falling behind in the exercise. His equipment was capable of incredible precision, but it required him to know where to look first. Sarah's ability to scan large areas quickly and identify anomalies was proving more valuable than raw magnification power. The other soldiers were starting to whisper among themselves, noting the stark difference in performance between the high-tech approach and the traditional methods. The exercise was building toward its climax, with the most challenging target still to be revealed. The coordinators had placed several objects at extreme distances, some over 3 kilometers away. These targets were designed to test the absolute limits of human observation capability. They required not just excellent equipment, but exceptional skill and experience to identify successfully. Sarah continued her methodical scanning, her weathered binoculars moving slowly across the distant mountains. She had entered a state of complete focus, her breathing steady and controlled. Years of experience had taught her to recognize the subtle signs that indicated human presence or artificial objects in natural settings. A slight variation in color, an unusual geometric shape, or movement that didn't match the natural rhythm of the environment. These were the clues that separated expert spotters from amateurs. The stage was now set for what would become a legendary moment in the unit's history, though none of them knew it yet. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the valley when the exercise coordinator announced the final phase. Captain Reynolds, a veteran officer with 25 years of experience, had designed this particular challenge to push his spotters to their absolute limits. Hidden somewhere in the vast mountainous landscape was a target that would test not just their equipment, but their dedication and skill. Sarah felt a familiar calm settle over her as she adjusted her grip on the worn binoculars. The leather strap, softened by decades of use, felt like an old friend against her neck. She had cleaned the lenses that morning with special care, knowing that even the smallest smudge could mean the difference between success and failure at extreme distances. These weren't just binoculars to her. They were a connection to her family's military heritage and a tool that had been proven in the crucible of real warfare. Marcus, meanwhile, was struggling with his digital equipment. The bright afternoon sun was creating glare on his tablet screen, making it difficult to read the data his scope was providing. He had invested so much time learning the technical specifications of his gear that he had never developed the intuitive feel for observation that came naturally to experienced spotters like Sarah. His expensive equipment was certainly capable of incredible performance, but it required a level of technical expertise that he was still developing. The target for this final phase was unlike anything they had attempted before. Captain Reynolds had positioned a small reflective marker on a distant peak, barely visible even under ideal conditions. The distance was approximately 3,200 meters, over 2 miles away, and the target was positioned in such a way that it would only be visible from a very specific angle and under the right lighting conditions. Most of the participants would be lucky to spot anything at all at such an extreme distance. As the exercise began, Sarah started her systematic scan of the distant mountains. She moved her binoculars slowly and deliberately, covering every inch of the terrain with methodical precision. Her breathing was controlled and steady, a technique her grandfather had taught her to minimize the shake that could blur distant objects. Each movement was purposeful, each pause calculated to allow her eyes time to process the information they were receiving. The other spotters were struggling with the extreme distance. Several had already given up, declaring the target impossible to spot with their equipment. Others were randomly scanning different areas, hoping to get lucky rather than employing any systematic approach. The frustration in their voices was evident as they communicated over the radio, each failed attempt adding to their growing sense of defeat. Marcus was having particular difficulty with his high-tech setup. The digital scope's automatic focusing system kept trying to lock onto closer objects like rocks and trees, preventing him from maintaining a steady view of the distant mountains. He spent more time adjusting settings and fighting with the technology than actually observing the terrain. His expensive equipment, designed to make spotting easier, was actually becoming a hindrance in the hands of someone who hadn't mastered its complexities. Sarah, however, continued her patient observation. She had divided the distant mountain range into a grid pattern in her mind, systematically examining each section before moving to the next. This was a technique that couldn't be programmed into any computer or automated by any digital system. It required human intelligence, experience, and an intimate understanding of how the human eye could be trained to detect the slightest anomalies in natural patterns. As she scanned the rocky slopes of the farthest visible peak, something caught her attention. It was barely perceptible, just a tiny glint of light that lasted only a fraction of a second. Most people would have dismissed it as imagination or a trick of the light, but Sarah's trained eye recognized it as potentially significant. She slowly moved her binoculars back to the area where she thought she had seen the reflection. The challenge with extreme distance spotting was that the target appeared incredibly small, even through powerful optics. At over 3,200 meters, even a relatively large object would appear as just a tiny speck. The human eye, even aided by quality binoculars, was operating at the very edge of its capabilities. Success required not just good vision, but an understanding of how light, atmosphere, and terrain interacted to create the subtle visual clues that indicated human presence. Sarah adjusted her position slightly, knowing that even a few inches of movement could change the angle enough to reveal or hide a distant target. She had learned this lesson during countless hours of practice and real-world missions. The science of observation was far more complex than most people realized, involving not just optical magnification, but an understanding of how environmental factors affected visibility. Through her grandfather's binoculars, she could see the distant peak more clearly now. The afternoon light was hitting the mountain at just the right angle, and she could make out individual rock formations and shadowed areas. Somewhere in that vast expanse of stone and vegetation was a target that the exercise designers believed would challenge even the most skilled spotters. Marcus was becoming increasingly frustrated with his inability to spot anything at the extreme distance. His digital scope had all the technological advantages, but he lacked the experience to use them effectively. He began to second-guess his equipment and his abilities, wondering if he had been overconfident about his technological approach. The expensive gear that had seemed so impressive during training exercises was proving inadequate for this real-world challenge. Other members of the unit were starting to radio in their failures. One by one, the experienced spotters were admitting defeat, declaring the target impossible to identify at such an extreme range. The mood was becoming somber, as it appeared that the exercise might end without a single successful identification. Captain Reynolds watched through his own observation equipment, wondering if he had made the challenge too difficult. Sarah remained focused on her systematic search. She had now covered roughly 60% of the target area, and while she hadn't definitively identified the target, she had ruled out large sections of the mountain where it definitely wasn't located. This process of elimination was just as important as positive identification. It allowed her to concentrate her attention on the most likely locations. As she continued her search, Sarah began to notice subtle patterns in the way the afternoon light played across the distant rocks. Her years of experience had taught her to recognize the difference between natural shadows and those created by artificial objects. She could distinguish between the random patterns of erosion and weathering and the more geometric shapes that indicated human placement. The radio crackled with more reports of failure. Even some of the unit's most experienced spotters were giving up, convinced that the target was beyond the range of their equipment. Marcus had stopped trying altogether, claiming that his digital scope wasn't designed for such extreme distances. The exercise was turning into a demonstration of the limits of human observation, rather than a test of skill and equipment. But Sarah wasn't ready to give up. She knew that her grandfather's binoculars had been used successfully in similar conditions during wartime. If they had been capable of spotting enemy positions at extreme distances under battlefield conditions, they could certainly handle a training exercise. The question wasn't whether the equipment was adequate. It was whether she had the skill and patience to use it effectively. The silence over the radio was becoming uncomfortable. 15 minutes had passed since the last spotter had admitted defeat, and Captain Reynolds was beginning to consider calling off the exercise. The afternoon sun was starting to lower, changing the lighting conditions and making an already difficult task even more challenging. Most training exercises didn't push participants to this level of frustration, but Reynolds believed in testing his people at the absolute limits of their capabilities. Sarah continued her methodical search, undeterred by the failures of her colleagues. She had moved into the final quadrant of her mental grid, examining an area of the distant peak that was partially obscured by atmospheric haze. The air at this distance created a shimmer effect that made details even harder to distinguish. But she had learned to work with these conditions rather than fight against them. Marcus had completely abandoned his spotting attempt and was now openly criticizing the entire exercise. He argued that asking people to identify targets at such extreme distances was unrealistic and served no practical purpose. His expensive, digital equipment sat unused beside him as he vented his frustration to anyone who would listen. The other soldiers were beginning to agree with him, suggesting that the exercise had been poorly designed. What none of them understood was that Sarah wasn't just looking for the target. She was reading the entire landscape like a book written in stone and shadow. Every rock formation, every vegetation pattern, every play of light and shadow told her something about the mountain. She had learned this approach from her grandfather, who had developed it during years of combat observation in Europe during World War II. Through her worn binoculars, Sarah began to notice something unusual about a particular section of the distant peak. There was a small area where the natural pattern of shadows seemed slightly different from what she would expect. It wasn't obvious. Just a subtle variation that would be invisible to most observers. But Sarah had spent thousands of hours studying terrain through these same lenses, and her eye had been trained to catch exactly this type of anomaly. She adjusted her position carefully, using a small rock as a rest to steady the binoculars. The target area was so distant that even the slightest movement would send it out of view entirely. She controlled her breathing, taking slow, steady breaths that wouldn't disturb her aim. This was a skill that couldn't be taught in any classroom or learned from any manual. It came only from years of patient practice and real-world experience. As Sarah focused on the suspicious area, she began to make out more details. The shadow pattern that had caught her attention was indeed artificial, too geometric to be natural erosion or rock formation, but she needed to be absolutely certain before making any announcement. A false identification at this point would be embarrassing, and would give Marcus and the other critics more ammunition for their arguments against traditional observation methods. The radio remained quiet, except for occasional static and the sound of people shifting positions. Some of the other spotters had given up entirely and were packing their equipment. The mood had shifted from competitive excitement to resignation and frustration. Captain Reynolds was checking his watch, clearly considering whether to end the exercise without a successful identification. Sarah took her time, examining every detail she could make out through the atmospheric distortion. The suspicious shadow was definitely not natural, but she needed to identify exactly what it was before calling it in. Her grandfather had taught her that patience was the most important quality for a military observer. Rushing to conclusions could have deadly consequences in real combat situations. Through her binoculars, she could now see that the geometric shadow was caused by a small object that was reflecting light differently than the surrounding rock. The reflection pattern suggested metal or glass, exactly what would be expected from the type of marker used in military training exercises. But the distance was so extreme that she needed to be absolutely certain of what she was seeing. Marcus noticed that Sarah was still actively observing and made another disparaging comment about wasting time with obsolete equipment. He suggested that if the target couldn't be spotted with modern digital technology, then it was unreasonable to expect anyone to find it with World War II-era binoculars. Several other soldiers nodded in agreement, clearly ready to end what they saw as a pointless exercise. Sarah ignored the criticism and continued her careful observation. She had found what she believed to be the target, but now came the most challenging part: determining the exact coordinates. At such an extreme distance, even a small error in angle calculation could result in coordinates that were hundreds of meters off target. She needed to use reference points and triangulation methods that required both mathematical precision and intuitive understanding of terrain. The afternoon light was continuing to change, and Sarah realized that her window of optimal viewing conditions was closing rapidly. The angle of the sun that had initially revealed the reflective target would soon shift, potentially making it invisible again. She needed to complete her identification and coordinate calculation quickly, but without sacrificing accuracy. Using techniques her grandfather had taught her, Sarah began to establish reference points around the target area. She identified distinctive rock formations and natural landmarks that she could use to triangulate the target's position. This was a completely manual process that required no technology beyond basic mathematics and careful observation skills. As she worked through her calculations, Sarah became increasingly confident that she had found the target. The object's position, the way it reflected light, and its relationship to the surrounding terrain all matched what would be expected from a training marker placed by military personnel. But she knew that making the announcement would subject her to intense scrutiny from both her supporters and critics. The radio crackled as Captain Reynolds prepared to call off the exercise. His voice carried a tone of disappointment as he began to announce that the challenge had proven too difficult for current conditions and equipment. This was exactly the moment when Sarah needed to speak up if she was going to make her identification known. Taking a deep breath, Sarah reached for her radio handset. She had double-checked her calculations and was confident in her identification, but she knew that the next few minutes would determine whether her traditional approach would be validated or ridiculed. The entire unit would be judging not just her accuracy, but the effectiveness of the observation methods that had been passed down through generations of military spotters. Marcus and the other critics were already preparing their arguments about the superiority of modern technology and the futility of relying on outdated equipment. They were convinced that the exercise had proven their point about the need for digital systems and automated targeting aids. Sarah's announcement would either silence these critics or provide them with additional evidence for their position. As she prepared to transmit her findings, Sarah felt the weight of her family's military tradition resting on her shoulders. Her grandfather's binoculars had served with distinction in some of the most challenging conditions imaginable, and now, they would face perhaps their ultimate test in a modern military context. Sarah keyed her radio and spoke with quiet confidence, her voice cutting through the disappointed murmur of conversations around her. "Base, this is Martinez. I have a positive identification on the target." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every conversation stopped, every head turned in her direction, and Marcus actually laughed out loud, shaking his head in disbelief. Captain Reynolds paused in his announcement, clearly surprised by Sarah's claim. His voice carried skepticism as he responded, "Martinez, are you certain? We've had negative reports from all other observers, including those with the most advanced equipment available." The doubt in his tone was obvious, and Sarah could see several soldiers exchanging glances that suggested they thought she was either mistaken or desperate to prove herself. Marcus stepped forward, his expensive digital equipment still powered down beside him. "Captain, with all due respect, if my state-of-the-art scope couldn't pick up anything at that range, I seriously doubt that antique binoculars could manage it. Maybe Martinez is seeing something that isn't there, or mistaking a natural rock formation for the target." His words carried the confidence of someone who believed technology was inherently superior to human skill and experience. Sarah remained calm despite the obvious skepticism from her colleagues. She had been in similar situations before, where her methods were questioned by people who placed more faith in expensive gadgets than proven techniques. "I understand the doubt, sir. The target is located on the northwest face of Peak 7, approximately 15 meters below the ridgeline. It's positioned behind a small outcropping that provides partial concealment from most viewing angles." The specificity of her description caused Captain Reynolds to sit up straighter. These weren't the vague generalities of someone making a desperate guess. They were the precise details of someone who had actually observed the target. He reached for his own high-powered telescope, a military-grade instrument that was even more advanced than Marcus's digital scope. As Reynolds began setting up his verification equipment, Marcus continued his criticism. Even if there is something in that general area, there's no way those old binoculars have the magnification power to identify a target at that distance with any certainty. This is exactly why the military has invested in modern digital systems, to eliminate the guesswork and human error that comes with outdated equipment. Other soldiers were beginning to take sides in the debate. Some supported Marcus's technological approach, arguing that millions of dollars in research and development couldn't be wrong about the superiority of digital systems. Others remembered Sarah's consistent performance over the years and were willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. The tension in the group was becoming palpable as they waited for Captain Reynolds to complete his verification. Sarah provided additional details to support her identification. The target appears to be a standard reflective marker, approximately 6 inches square, mounted on a metal stake. The reflection pattern suggests it's angled slightly downward, which is why it's only visible from our current position when the sun hits it at the correct angle. The technical accuracy of her description impressed even some of her critics. Captain Reynolds was having difficulty with his own equipment, struggling with the extreme distance and changing light conditions. The sun was continuing to move, altering the shadows and making observation increasingly challenging. He adjusted his telescope settings multiple times, clearly frustrated by his inability to immediately verify Sarah's claim. This technical difficulty only reinforced Marcus's arguments about the impossibility of spotting targets at such extreme ranges. While the captain worked with his equipment, Sarah took the opportunity to explain her methodology. The key isn't just magnification power, it's understanding how to read the terrain and recognize when something doesn't belong. These binoculars have been used in combat conditions where lives depended on accurate observation. They've been proven in situations far more challenging than any training exercise. Marcus scoffed at her explanation. That's just romantic nostalgia about the good old days. Modern warfare requires modern tools. Digital systems provide objective measurements and eliminate the subjective interpretations that lead to errors. He gestured toward his expensive scope, which remained powered down and unused. This equipment can measure distances to the meter, account for atmospheric conditions, and provide digital enhancement of targets. Human eyes and old lenses simply can't compete with that level of precision. The debate was interrupted by Captain Reynolds, who had finally managed to locate the general area Sarah had described. Through his powerful telescope, he could see the section of Peak 7 she had mentioned, but he was having difficulty identifying the specific target. The distance was at the very edge of even his advanced equipment's capabilities, and the changing light was making observation extremely challenging. Sarah offered to guide him to the exact location. "Sir, if you focus on the large boulder that's shaped like a triangle about 20 meters left of where you're looking, then move slowly to the right until you see a vertical crack in the rock face. The target is just below that crack, partially hidden by a small ledge." Her detailed knowledge of the terrain impressed everyone listening, including some of her harshest critics. Following Sarah's guidance, Captain Reynolds began to make out more details of the distant mountainside. Her description was proving accurate. There was indeed a triangular boulder and a vertical crack exactly where she had said they would be. This level of detailed terrain knowledge suggested that she had genuinely observed the area through her binoculars, not simply made lucky guesses about the target location. As Reynolds adjusted his telescope based on Sarah's directions, Marcus became increasingly agitated. His technological superiority argument was being undermined by Sarah's apparent success with equipment he had dismissed as obsolete. He began questioning whether the exercise had been designed fairly, suggesting that perhaps Sarah had been given advance information about the target location. The accusation of cheating caused an immediate reaction from other members of the unit. Several soldiers who had worked with Sarah for years spoke up in her defense, citing her reputation for integrity and her consistent performance in previous exercises. The suggestion that she would compromise her professional ethics to win a training exercise was seen as insulting and inappropriate. Captain Reynolds called for silence as he continued his verification process. The telescope's view was becoming clearer as he followed Sarah's detailed guidance. and he was beginning to make out what appeared to be an artificial object in the location she had specified. The discovery was causing him to reconsider his assumptions about the capabilities of different observation methods. Sarah remained patient throughout the verification process, confident in her identification, but understanding the skepticism of her colleagues. She had faced similar situations throughout her career, where her traditional methods were questioned by people who believed that newer automatically meant better. Her grandfather had prepared her for these moments, teaching her that skill and experience would ultimately prove themselves regardless of the equipment being used. The tension in the group was reaching its peak as Captain Reynolds made final adjustments to his telescope. The outcome of his verification would either validate Sarah's traditional approach or confirm the critics' arguments about the superiority of modern technology. Everyone present understood that this moment would have implications far beyond a simple training exercise. Captain Reynolds suddenly straightened up from his telescope, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement. "I'll be damned," he said quietly, then louder. "Martinez, you're absolutely correct. There's definitely a reflective target exactly where you described it." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of wind across the observation post. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, confusion, and then something approaching panic. He had staked his reputation on the superiority of his expensive digital equipment, and now a soldier using World War II-era binoculars had accomplished something his state-of-the-art scope had failed to do. He stammered, "That's impossible. There must be some mistake. Let me check with my equipment." But as Marcus frantically began setting up his digital scope, Captain Reynolds was already taking precise measurements of the target location. Using his military-grade rangefinder, he determined that the target was located at exactly 3,247 meters from their observation post, well over 2 miles away. The distance was so extreme that it pushed the boundaries of human visual observation capabilities, even with quality optical equipment. The number 3,247 meters began to sink in among the assembled soldiers. This wasn't just a successful target identification, it was potentially a record-breaking achievement for visual observation at extreme distance. The military kept records of such accomplishments, and if verified, Sarah's identification would represent one of the longest confirmed visual spots in recent military history. Sarah remained characteristically modest about her achievement. "It's not about the equipment," she explained to the stunned group. "It's about understanding how to use what you have effectively. These binoculars taught me to really see the terrain, not just look at it. When you spend enough time studying an area, you learn to recognize when something doesn't belong." Marcus finally got his digital scope operational and attempted to locate the target Sarah had identified. Even with her precise coordinates and Captain Reynolds' confirmation, he struggled to find the marker through his advanced optics. The sophisticated automatic focusing system kept locking onto closer objects, and the bright display screen was difficult to read in the changing afternoon light. His expensive equipment, which had seemed so impressive in controlled conditions, was proving problematic in the real-world environment. Captain Reynolds began documenting the achievement for his official report. The successful identification of a target at 3,247 meters using basic optical equipment would need to be verified by higher command and potentially submitted for recognition. He realized that Sarah had not only completed the training exercise successfully, but had possibly set a new standard for long-distance visual observation. The other soldiers were beginning to process what they had witnessed. Many of them had expensive equipment sitting unused, while Sarah had achieved something extraordinary, with binoculars that were older than some of their grandparents. The demonstration was forcing them to reconsider their assumptions about the relationship between technology and effectiveness. Marcus was becoming increasingly desperate as he failed to replicate Sarah's success with his digital scope. He began blaming his equipment, suggesting that perhaps the battery was low or the calibration was off. But his protests were sounding hollow to the other soldiers, who could see that his technological confidence had been shaken by the day's events. Sarah offered to help Marcus locate the target through his scope, demonstrating the collaborative spirit that had always characterized her approach to military service. She guided him through the same process she had used with Captain Reynolds, providing detailed landmarks and reference points to help him navigate the complex terrain at extreme distance. With Sarah's assistance, Marcus was finally able to spot the target through his digital equipment. The experience was humbling for someone who had been so confident about technological superiority. He could see now that the advanced features of his scope were useless without the knowledge and experience to apply them effectively. The equipment was capable of impressive performance, but only when operated by someone who understood both the technology and the principles of observation. Captain Reynolds announced that he would be submitting Sarah's achievement for official recognition and possible inclusion in military observation records. The 3247-meter identification represented not just a training success but a demonstration of human capabilities that challenged conventional assumptions about the limitations of visual observation. The mood among the soldiers began to shift as they realized they had witnessed something truly exceptional. The competitive atmosphere that had characterized the earlier part of the exercise was replaced by genuine respect for Sarah's accomplishment. Even some of Marcus's strongest supporters were beginning to acknowledge that expensive equipment was no substitute for skill and experience. Sarah took the opportunity to share some of the lessons her grandfather had taught her about observation and military service. She explained that the most important equipment was not the hardware, but the training and mindset that allowed someone to use any tool effectively. Her grandfather had succeeded with these same binoculars because he had developed the patience, skill, and understanding necessary to push them to their limits. The afternoon sun was continuing to change the lighting conditions on the distant mountain, and the target that Sarah had identified was becoming increasingly difficult to see. Captain Reynolds noted that the window for spotting the marker at such extreme distance had been very narrow, making Sarah's success even more impressive. She had not only found the target but had done so under optimal conditions that wouldn't last much longer. As the exercise officially concluded, the soldiers began discussing what they had witnessed. Many were re-evaluating their assumptions about modern technology and traditional methods. Sarah's success had demonstrated that the newest and most expensive equipment wasn't automatically the most effective, and that human skill and experience remained crucial factors in military effectiveness. Marcus was struggling to process his changed understanding of technology and capability. His entire identity had been built around his mastery of advanced equipment, and Sarah's success with basic tools had forced him to confront the limitations of his approach. He was beginning to realize that he had focused so much on learning about his equipment that he had never developed the fundamental observation skills that made any equipment truly effective. The key 3247-meter record was already becoming legendary among the soldiers present. They understood that they had witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come, a demonstration of human capability that challenged modern assumptions about technology and effectiveness. Sarah's achievement would become a benchmark against which future spotters would measure themselves. Captain Reynolds began planning how to incorporate the lessons of this exercise into future training programs. Sarah's success suggested that the military might need to reconsider its emphasis on expensive technology and place more value on developing the fundamental skills that made any equipment effective. The day had provided valuable insights into the relationship between human capability and technological tools. 3 months after the record-breaking observation, Sarah Martinez found herself standing before a room full of military brass and training specialists from bases across the country. The news of her 3247-meter identification had spread through military communications channels, and she had been invited to present her methods at a special conference on observation techniques and equipment effectiveness. The official verification process had confirmed every detail of her achievement. Military surveyors had precisely measured the distance using GPS coordinates. Meteorologists had analyzed the atmospheric conditions that day, and equipment specialists had examined her grandfather's binoculars to understand how such an extraordinary result had been possible. The conclusion was unanimous. Sarah had accomplished something that challenged conventional understanding of human visual capabilities. Marcus had undergone his own transformation following the exercise. The humbling experience of being outperformed by equipment he had dismissed as obsolete had forced him to reevaluate his entire approach to military service. He had sought out Sarah's guidance and begun learning the traditional observation techniques that she had inherited from her grandfather. His expensive digital scope remained part of his equipment, But he now understood that technology was only as effective as the person operating it. During her presentation to the assembled officers, Sarah emphasized that her success wasn't about rejecting modern technology, but about understanding the fundamental principles that made any observation equipment effective. She explained how her grandfather's wartime experience had taught her to read terrain like a language, recognizing the subtle patterns and anomalies that indicated human eye presence or artificial objects. The military leadership was particularly interested in how traditional observation methods could enhance the effectiveness of modern digital systems. Sarah demonstrated that the most advanced equipment was only as good as the operator's ability to understand what they were looking for and where to look for it. Her grandfather's binoculars had succeeded not because they were superior to modern scopes, but because she had developed the skills necessary to use any optical equipment to its maximum potential. The conference led to significant changes in military training programs across multiple bases. Traditional observation techniques were reintroduced alongside modern technology training, creating a more comprehensive approach to spotter development. New recruits would learn both the patience and methodical approach that Sarah represented and the technical capabilities of advanced digital equipment. Marcus became one of Sarah's most enthusiastic students, combining his technological knowledge with newly learned traditional skills. The experience had taught him that his expensive equipment could be incredibly effective when operated by someone who understood the fundamental principles of observation. He developed into one of the unit's most capable spotters, using both digital systems and basic optical equipment with equal proficiency. The story of Sarah's 3,247-meter record became part of military folklore, passed down through training programs as an example of how human skill and determination could overcome technological limitations. New recruits learned about the soldier who had achieved something extraordinary with World War II-era binoculars, proving that experience and technique were just as important as the latest equipment. Captain Reynolds used the incident to redesign his unit's training approach, creating exercises that emphasized skill development alongside equipment familiarity. He instituted regular competitions between different observation methods, encouraging healthy rivalry between traditional and modern approaches, while ensuring that all soldiers developed comprehensive capabilities. Sarah's grandfather's binoculars were eventually donated to the base's military museum, where they became a symbol of the enduring importance of human skill in an increasingly technological world. A plaque beside the display case told the story of their final military achievement, inspiring new generations of soldiers to understand that the most important equipment they carried was their training and dedication. The 3,247-meter record stood for several years before being broken by another spotter who had been trained using the combined traditional and modern methods that Sarah's achievement had inspired. The new record holder credited Sarah's techniques as being crucial to their success, demonstrating how the lessons learned from that remarkable afternoon continued to influence military observation capabilities. Years later, Sarah reflected on how the day that had started with mockery and skepticism had transformed into a career-defining moment that influenced military training practices across the country. Her grandfather's legacy had been validated in the most public way possible, proving that the skills and equipment he had passed down remained relevant in the modern military environment. The incident also changed how the military approached equipment procurement and training budgets. While advanced technology remained important, greater emphasis was placed on developing the human capabilities that made any equipment truly effective. Sarah's success had demonstrated that the most expensive tools were worthless without the knowledge and experience to use them properly. Marcus eventually became an instructor himself, teaching new recruits about the importance of combining traditional observation skills with modern technology. He often told the story of how his arrogance about expensive equipment had been humbled by a soldier with 70-year-old binoculars, using his experience as a cautionary tale about the dangers of technological overconfidence. The transformation extended beyond just the observation specialists. Other military units began examining whether their own reliance on advanced technology had caused them to neglect fundamental skills that remained crucial for mission success. Sarah's achievement became a catalyst for broader discussions about the relationship between human capability and technological advancement in military contexts. Sarah continued her military service with the same quiet professionalism that had always characterized her approach. But now, with the added responsibility of mentoring new spotters and sharing the techniques that had made her successful, she remained modest about her achievement, always emphasizing that the record had been possible only because of the lessons passed down through generations of military observers on the worn leather strap and chipped paint of her grandfather. Binoculars had told a story of service and dedication that resonated far beyond a single training exercise. The 3,247-meter record became more than just a number. It represented the enduring value of human skill, patience, and understanding in an age of rapidly advancing technology. Sarah had proven that sometimes the oldest tools, in the right hands, could still achieve the most extraordinary results.